Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we usually think about World War II, our minds instantly go to the grand generals, sweeping tactical maps, Churchill, Roosevelt, and all those big diplomatic conferences. But today, we're going to radically shift our focus. We are zooming all the way in to look at the deeply personal, honestly harrowing reality of just one single rural soldier, Mir Zaman. We're building history from the ground up, not the top down. Just listen to this powerful quote from his unpublished memoirs. He writes, "What emerges from the Burma front is not the glamour of war, but its bitter reality." That literally strips away all the typical glory, right? You won't find the big political leaders in these pages. Instead, this completely forces us to rethink how this massive global conflict was actually experienced on the ground by the ordinary people who just got swept up in the whole thing. Which brings us to a really difficult question about our official archives. Whose voices are actually missing from our history books? Let's dive right into this explainer and figure out exactly why the lived experiences of ordinary colonial subjects are so often just completely erased from the official state records.
Think about the striking contrast here. While the history we usually learn is built on elite tactics, troop movements, and politicians, for colonial subjects like Mir Zaman, the war was experienced through a totally different lens. I mean, it was reality defined entirely by hunger, rampant disease, systemic poverty, and just this faint, desperate hope that a soldier's salary might somehow save their family from total financial ruin.
All right, Section 1, History's Missing Page. So, Mir Zaman was born around 1926 near Taxila. And what's wild is that his rare handwritten manuscript, along with just a single dignified studio portrait, only survived because they were carefully kept in his family's private custody, specifically by his grandson. Think about it. While generals have their memoirs carefully edited and preserved by the state, the voices of colonial soldiers are incredibly vulnerable. They're saved from being permanently lost, literally by sheer chance and family dedication. Section 2. Desperation, not patriotism.
So long before Mir Zaman ever saw a battlefield, the crushing imperial structures of debt had already invaded his home. His family were tenant farmers, and they tried to improve their lot by digging an irrigation well near Jandil. Well, it turned into an absolute financial disaster. The whole thing spiraled into compounding debt to local moneylenders, which forced them to mortgage and sell their land, and that eventually led to devastating court cases that just completely consumed their stable life.
And this is an absolutely crucial point to understand. Joining the colonial army was rarely, if ever, about some deep loyalty to the British Empire. No, recruitment was driven by pure, unadulterated desperation. Rural families sent their sons into the military machine for one simple reason: farming couldn't feed them anymore. The human cost of this systemic failure was just devastating. Mir Zaman wasn't just a farmhand. The guy was a brilliant student. He topped his class, actually won a scholarship, but he had to abandon his education entirely to go do farm labor, simply because his older brothers were consumed by the military draft. Sure, the colonial army provided salaries, but it completely swallowed up the labor and the future aspirations of rural households. We can actually trace how this system consumed colonial bodies by looking at his older brother, Muhammad Ashraf. He deployed from Allahabad, was sent all the way overseas to Burma and Iraq, only to return home to Taxila, basically on his deathbed, suffering from tuberculosis. And the ultimate tragedy here, his family was so impoverished by this point that they couldn't even afford to properly host basic hospitality for his funeral.
But, you know, history isn't just about economics and timelines. Sometime later, when Ashraf's grave was reopened for repairs, locals found his body perfectly preserved, even emitting a fragrance. Now, modern readers might just write this off as folklore, but we have to understand that this was a historical reality for them. It shows exactly how rural communities processed the immense trauma of war. They interpreted sacrifice through a profound spiritual and religious lens, not through some official military archive.
Moving on to Section 3, Bitter Realities of Burma.
If you had any lingering illusions about military glory, they're going to shatter right here. Mir Zaman was drafted with immense reluctance. He actually deserted briefly before being caught and trained as a wireless operator, and his memoir vividly records a harrowing sensory nightmare in the Burmese jungle. He describes the absolute terror of endless artillery fire, rampant malaria, and the desperate reality of surviving on literally nothing but chickpeas boiled with red chilies because the supply chains were totally broken.
That brings us to Section 4, Humanity Amidst War.
Yet, right in the middle of all this brutality, his writings reveal these deeply moving, fleeting moments of human connection that you'd never find in official records. Things like fulfilling a dying Muslim comrade's wish for a roadside burial,
Or Burmese villagers who had suffered terribly under Japanese occupation welcoming Indian troops with white flags. Even sharing a simple meal of rice pudding near the Irrawaddy River with local village girls, or getting a few words of encouragement from a Sikh instructor. These sincere, localized acts of care completely reclaim the individual humanity that grand military histories tend to erase.
And it's really fascinating because he doesn't paint the British purely as these one-dimensional oppressors. He very impartially notes that his British commanding officers were suffering the exact same grueling, horrific battlefield conditions right alongside him. So the military really emerges as this complex web of shared suffering and daily survival across racial lines.
Which leads into our final section, Empires Changing Uniforms.
Triggered by terrifying rumors of atomic bombs, which Mir Zaman basically understood as just catastrophic mass death, the war finally drew to an exhausting close. But consider the massive geographical scale of his deployments. From Rawalpindi to Imphal, Mandalay to Madras, all the way to Waziristan, he traveled further than anyone in his village could have ever imagined. But we really have to remember, this movement was never an expression of his own freedom. It was entirely dictated at the empire's command.
The transition out of the war was practically seamless, and honestly, completely chaotic. After demobilization, soldiers like Mir Zaman were thrust straight into the incredibly violent partition of India in 1947. He went right from the British Army into the Pakistan police. It just goes to prove that the imperial structures of authority didn't vanish. They literally just changed uniforms.
Mir Zaman eventually passed away in 1994, his gravestone in Taxila silently marking the life of a colonial private. So as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask the core question, why does this single, unpublished, handwritten memoir matter so much to us today?
It matters because it serves as a stark, undeniable reminder that massive global events are always lived locally. For rural South Asians, the Second World War was not some abstract ideological battle between fascism and democracy. No, it was a tangible, physical force. It invaded their homes, severed their education, mortgaged their lands, spread disease, and forcefully transformed farmers into soldiers.
His legacy challenges the elite histories of both the British Empire and modern nationalism. As one historian beautifully put it, they do not speak in the language of ideology, they speak in the language of survival. Mir Zaman's words leave us with a powerful realization. The most authentic archive of any war is the simple, brutal act of survival. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. What if the truest history of the world isn't written in the grand treaties of empires, but in the desperate, handwritten notes of those who simply tried to survive them? Thanks for exploring this with me today.